The decision that cost the hospital its newest nurse would come back before sunset, when the unmistakable sound of military rotors rolled across the parking lot, and a question no administrator could answer echoed through the emergency department. "Where is our combat medic?" Just hours earlier, Emily Carter had been standing beneath the bright trauma bay lights on only her third shift at St. Andrew's Regional Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. At 31, with steady blue eyes, neatly tied chestnut hair, and a spotless uniform, she looked like every other newly hired emergency room nurse trying to earn the trust of an experienced staff. No one knew much about her beyond a short resume, excellent references, and a habit of arriving 45 minutes before every shift. While most nurses headed straight for the break room, Emily always inspected the trauma carts, checked tourniquets, verified airway equipment, and quietly reorganized supplies that somehow seemed easier to find after she touched them. Some coworkers appreciated the extra effort, but others rolled their eyes, assuming she was trying too hard to impress management. Dr. Nathan Brooks, the hospital's respected chief of emergency medicine, noticed her unusual routines but dismissed them as the nervous habits of an inexperienced nurse determined to look prepared. His focus stayed on keeping one of the busiest ERs in Central Ohio running smoothly, not on understanding why a new employee treated every shift as though lives could change within seconds. The answer arrived sooner than anyone expected. A multiple vehicle collision on Interstate 70 sent several patients to the emergency department within minutes, transforming a routine afternoon into organized chaos. Ambulance crews rolled stretchers through the automatic doors while physicians divided incoming cases according to standard trauma protocols. Emily accepted her assigned patient without hesitation, quickly recognizing subtle signs that suggested the woman's condition might become unstable despite reassuring initial vital signs. She immediately prepared additional supplies and requested equipment before anyone else realized they might be needed. Another nurse questioned why she was moving ahead of the physician's instructions, and a resident reminded her that treatment decisions belonged to the attending doctor. Emily answered with a concise clinical observation rather than an argument, but the room had already decided she was stepping beyond her role. Moments later, the attending physician reassessed the patient and chose a different approach based on the available information. Nathan witnessed the exchange from across the trauma bay. To him, the issue was no longer whether Emily's concern had merit. It was that a brand-new nurse had challenged the chain of command during an active emergency. When the immediate crisis settled and every patient had been stabilized, he called Emily into a conference room with a nursing supervisor and a representative from Human Resources. Emily listened without interrupting as Nathan explained that independent actions and deviations from established procedure could undermine teamwork in a high-pressure emergency department. The supervisor added that probationary employees were expected to earn trust before exercising judgment beyond direct instructions. Emily never defended herself, never mentioned her previous experience, and never suggested anyone had misunderstood her intentions. She simply unclipped her hospital badge, placed it carefully on the polished table, thanked them for the opportunity, and walked out carrying a small canvas bag that looked far older than the rest of her belongings. Several staff members watched through the glass doors, convinced they had just seen another overconfident new hire fail to adapt. None of them noticed that Nathan remained staring at the badge long after Emily disappeared from the hallway, unsettled by the strange feeling that the hospital had just let someone go without ever learning who she really was. The emergency department settled into an uneasy rhythm after Emily Carter left, but her absence lingered in ways no one expected. During the evening shift change, a supply technician paused beside Trauma Bay 3 and frowned at the neatly organized emergency cart. Every airway device sat in exact order by size. Intravenous access kits were grouped by urgency instead of manufacturer, and backup tourniquets had been placed where any nurse could reach them without turning away from a patient. No one remembered arranging the equipment that way. A veteran-charge nurse shrugged and admitted that finding supplies had somehow become faster during the past 3 days. Another nurse replied that Emily must have reorganized everything before she was fired, then dismissed it as the habit of someone obsessed with details. Even so, nobody changed the layout because it simply worked better than the old system. Dr. Nathan Brooks tried to focus on the steady stream of patients arriving through the ambulance entrance. Yet he found himself replaying the meeting in his office. Emily had accepted her termination without arguing, without blaming anyone, and without mentioning the patient whose condition had worried her. That silence bothered him more than any heated disagreement could have. Experienced emergency nurses usually defended their clinical judgment with confidence, but Emily had walked away as though she had learned long ago that explaining herself rarely changed people's minds. The thought irritated him because it refused to disappear, even while he reviewed laboratory results and approved treatment plans. During a quieter moment, two nurses began talking about the new employee they had barely known. One remembered arriving before sunrise and finding Emily checking expiration dates on blood tubing and emergency medications without being asked. Another recalled watching her trace evacuation routes posted on hallway maps with unusual attention, almost as if memorizing every exit in the building. Someone joked that she acted more like a safety inspector than a rookie nurse, but the laughter faded when the respiratory therapist mentioned that Emily had somehow learned every trauma room after a single orientation shift. Most new hires still asked for directions after a week. Emily never had. Nathan overheard part of the conversation while signing discharge paperwork. He dismissed it at first, reminding himself that careful people often developed efficient habits. Still, another memory surfaced. Earlier that week, he had walked into the emergency department before dawn and noticed Emily standing near the ambulance entrance instead of sitting in the break room. She had been studying the flow of incoming vehicles, timing how long it took paramedics to reach each trauma bay, and making notes on a folded pocket notebook. When he asked what she was doing, she simply answered that every second mattered when a patient could not wait. He had assumed she was trying to impress her supervisors. Now that explanation felt incomplete. The final clue arrived almost by accident. A housekeeping employee found a laminated checklist tucked behind a storage bin Emily had cleaned before leaving. It was not hospital property, and it contained no confidential information, only a handwritten sequence for preparing emergency equipment in the first 5 minutes after multiple casualties arrived. The terminology sounded different from the hospital's standard training language, using phrases that none of the nurses recognized from civilian emergency manuals. Nathan studied the page for several seconds before folding it carefully and placing it in his coat pocket. He could not explain why a recently hired nurse carried procedures that seemed to come from somewhere else, but for the first time since Emily walked away, he wondered whether the hospital had misunderstood far more than one difficult decision, and outside, far beyond the walls of St. Andrew's Regional Medical Center, the distant thump of approaching rotor blades began to roll across the evening sky. The emergency department did not realize how much Emily Carter had changed its daily routine until the next critical patient arrived. A middle-aged construction worker was brought in after a workplace accident with signs of possible internal injuries. As the trauma team assembled, one of the nurses reached instinctively toward the emergency cart that Emily had reorganized only hours before. Every item appeared exactly where it was needed. Intravenous supplies, airway equipment, pressure dressings, and monitoring accessories were retrieved without hesitation, saving valuable moments during the patient's evaluation. Nobody mentioned Emily by name at first, but several staff members exchanged brief glances as they recognized how smoothly the room functioned because of decisions she had made before walking out the hospital doors. Dr. Nathan Brooks noticed the difference immediately. Normally, new staff members needed weeks before they understood the rhythm of a busy emergency department. Yet Emily had somehow improved the workflow after only a few shifts. He found himself opening the folded checklist again during a brief pause between patients. The sequence described priorities that matched accepted emergency medicine principles, but the wording remained unfamiliar. Instead of referring only to hospital procedures, it emphasized preserving mobility, maintaining multiple evacuation options, and preparing backup equipment before anyone requested it. Nathan had attended conferences across the country and reviewed countless emergency protocols, but he had never seen instructions written quite like these. He slipped the paper back into his pocket, unable to explain why something so ordinary now seemed strangely important. Meanwhile, conversations about Emily quietly spread through the department. A veteran paramedic remembered that during orientation, she had correctly identified every trauma instrument without checking the labels. Another employee recalled watching her lift a loaded medical backpack and instinctively adjust the shoulder straps for better weight distribution before handing it to a coworker. A security officer added that Emily had asked where the hospital's emergency generator switches were located during her first building tour, explaining that she simply liked understanding how facilities handled unexpected situations. None of those actions violated policy, yet together they painted the picture of someone whose habits had been shaped by experiences far beyond a normal nursing career. Nathan tried to dismiss the growing speculation, but another unexpected discovery challenged his confidence. Reviewing electronic records from the earlier highway collision, he noticed that Emily's brief clinical concern about her patient had not been unreasonable after all. Follow-up imaging ordered later in the evening revealed injuries that had developed exactly where she suspected additional monitoring might become necessary. She had not ignored protocol or invented a diagnosis. She had recognized subtle warning signs before they became obvious. Her judgment had been early rather than reckless. The realization settled heavily on him because it suggested he might have confused confidence with insubordination. Before he had time to process that thought, a deep rhythmic vibration rolled through the hospital windows. At first, several people assumed another medical helicopter was approaching the rooftop landing pad. Within seconds, the sound grew louder than any routine air ambulance. Nurses looked toward the parking lot. Patients near the entrance glanced outside. Security radios crackled with overlapping voices reporting multiple black sport utility vehicles entering hospital property, while a large military helicopter descended toward an open section beyond the visitor parking area. Nathan stepped to the emergency department entrance just as uniformed security officers hurried outside, and every conversation inside the hospital stopped when someone whispered that whoever had arrived was not there for a patient. Hospital security officers moved toward the entrance expecting to receive instructions from a medical flight crew, but the scene unfolding outside did not resemble any emergency transfer they had handled before. The helicopter settled beyond the visitor parking area without activating civilian medical markings, while 4 black sport utility vehicles stopped in precise formation near the emergency department entrance. Their passengers stepped out wearing plain tactical jackets with no visible unit patches, speaking into discreet communication headsets instead of rushing toward the trauma base. Through the glass doors, nurses exchanged uncertain looks as the visitors surveyed the building with practiced efficiency, paying more attention to entrances, exits, and sight lines than to the hospital itself. Dr. Nathan Brooks walked outside with the nursing supervisor, expecting someone to request assistance for an injured service member. Instead, the senior man leading the group looked directly at Nathan and asked a single question. Who is in charge of this emergency department? Nathan introduced himself, but before he could ask why they had arrived, the visitor produced a federal identification wallet that confirmed government authority without revealing much else. The credentials were legitimate, though the agency name was unfamiliar to everyone standing nearby. The man thanked Nathan for his cooperation, then asked whether Emily Carter had reported for work that morning. Nathan hesitated for the first time all day. The question caught him completely off guard because nobody outside the hospital should have known the name of a probationary nurse who had worked only a handful of shifts. Choosing his words carefully, he answered that Emily was no longer employed there. The expression on the visitor's face did not change, but several members of his team exchanged brief glances that suggested the answer carried unexpected consequences. Before Nathan could ask another question, one of the visitors unfolded a small photograph that appeared to show Emily several years younger. She wore plain clothing, carried a weathered medical backpack, and stood beside an aircraft that had no identifying markings visible in the picture. Nothing in the image directly indicated military service, yet the equipment she carried looked well used rather than ceremonial. The visitor compared the photograph with the hospital employee badge picture Nathan had displayed on his tablet, nodded once, and slipped it back into a secure folder. A security officer standing nearby noticed another item inside the folder for only a fraction of a second before it disappeared. It looked like a worn medical qualification patch sewn onto faded fabric instead of a modern uniform. Nobody said a word about it, but the glimpse was enough to deepen the mystery surrounding the nurse they had dismissed only hours earlier. Nathan felt the folded checklist in his coat pocket and remembered its unfamiliar terminology. He suddenly wondered whether the language that had seemed so unusual belonged to a world completely outside. Civilian medicine. The visitor interrupted his thoughts with another measured question. Dr. Brooks, did Miss Carter leave anything behind? Nathan admitted that she had turned in only her identification badge before leaving with a small canvas bag. The man's attention sharpened immediately. Did she still have the bag when she left the property? Nathan answered that she did. For the first time, the visitor released a slow breath, almost as though an important concern had been resolved. Then he looked toward the helicopter waiting beyond the parking lot before turning back to Nathan with a level voice. We need to find Emily Carter immediately. She is one of ours. The words hung over the entrance in complete silence, yet before Nathan could ask what that statement truly meant, another vehicle entered the parking lot carrying someone whose arrival would change everything. Another black sport utility vehicle rolled to a stop beside the others, and an older man stepped out wearing civilian clothes beneath a weatherproof field jacket. Unlike the rest of the team, he carried no visible credentials in his hand. The moment he reached the entrance, every member of the government group shifted slightly to give him space without being instructed. He looked at Dr. Nathan Brooks for only a second before asking, "Where is Emily Carter?" Nathan repeated the answer he had already given. She was terminated this afternoon. The words seemed to drain the color from several faces. The older man closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once as though confirming the one outcome he had hoped to avoid. When he looked back at Nathan, his voice remained controlled. "Doctor, you did not dismiss an ordinary emergency room nurse today. You dismissed the combat medic who kept some of my people alive when no one else could reach them." Silence settled across the entrance. Nobody spoke because nobody knew how to respond. Nathan instinctively reached into his coat and unfolded the handwritten checklist Emily had left behind. The visitor recognized it immediately without taking it from his hand. "She still carries that format," he said. "She wrote the original version years ago. We still teach parts of it during specialized field medical training." Nathan stared at the page he had assumed belonged to an overly meticulous nurse. The unfamiliar wording suddenly made sense. It had never been written for a civilian emergency department. It had been created for situations where medical teams had to work with limited equipment under extreme pressure, adapting standard trauma principles to unpredictable environments. Every unusual habit Emily displayed during her short time at the hospital now connected into a pattern that nobody inside St. Andrews had recognized. One of the nurses standing nearby whispered that Emily had reorganized every trauma card according to the same sequence shown on the checklist. The older man answered without hesitation. "That is because she prepares every room the same way. She believes the right equipment should never be more than one movement away from the person trying to save a life." Nathan remembered watching Emily inspect tourniquets before sunrise, memorize evacuation routes, and position emergency supplies without being asked. None of those actions had been attempts to impress anyone. They were habits developed through years of disciplined experience. The realization struck harder than any accusation could have. He had mistaken professional instincts for arrogance simply because they appeared in someone wearing the badge of a newly hired nurse. The government team's communications specialist approached with a tablet and quietly confirmed Emily's employee photograph through a secure database. The screen displayed only a verified identity notice followed by a classification warning that automatically concealed the remaining information. Even the name of the organization remained hidden behind restricted access. The older man looked at the confirmation, then addressed Nathan once more. "There are details I cannot discuss, and there are missions that will never become public record. What I can tell you is simple. Emily Carter served as a combat medic in places where evacuation was delayed, resources were limited, and every decision mattered. That experience is exactly why she recognized problems before others did." Today, Nathan lowered his eyes, realizing the patient Emily had questioned had later developed exactly the complication she anticipated. Before he could apologize or ask another question, the older man turned toward his team and gave a brief instruction. "Find her immediately. She does not know we are here yet, and she deserves to hear this from us before anyone else does." Every member of the group moved at once while the helicopter continued idling in the fading evening light. leaving the stunned hospital staff to wonder why an entire government team had crossed the country for one former emergency room nurse who, until that afternoon, nobody believed was extraordinary. The older man remained at the hospital entrance as his team spread across the surrounding streets. But before anyone left, he turned back toward the stunned staff with an expression that carried more gratitude than authority. "You deserve to understand one thing," he said. Emily never introduced herself by what she used to do because she promised she never would. Nobody interrupted him. Even the emergency department seemed unusually still as stretchers continued moving in the background and ambulance radios echoed through the bay. Dr. Nathan Brooks found himself listening less as a physician and more as someone realizing he had completely misjudged another human being. The visitor glanced toward the helicopter before continuing. "Combat medics are not remembered because they receive recognition. They are remembered because someone made it home who otherwise would not have." Those words settled over the group with unexpected weight. One of the younger nurses finally asked whether Emily had served as a battlefield medic for many years. The older man considered the question before answering. Long enough to understand that medicine is not only about treatment. It is about keeping hope alive until the next minute arrives. He never mentioned locations or operations, and he never described combat. Instead, he spoke about long nights treating exhausted teammates with limited supplies, making careful decisions under relentless pressure, and refusing to leave injured people behind until someone else could safely continue their care. Nathan realized those values explained everything Emily had done during her short time at St. Andrews. She had not been trying to stand out. She had simply continued living by habits that had once protected lives in environments very different from a civilian hospital. A respiratory therapist quietly admitted that Emily had stayed after every shift to restock equipment without claiming overtime. Another nurse remembered finding handwritten reminders encouraging staff to check backup oxygen cylinders before busy weekends. Everyone had assumed those notes came from hospital educators. Now they understood that Emily had written them because she believed preparation was an act of compassion rather than routine paperwork. The older man smiled faintly when he heard those stories. "That sounds exactly like her," he said. "She never waits for someone to ask before making the next person safer." Nathan lowered his eyes, remembering how quickly he had interpreted Emily's initiative as defiance. The realization became even harder to accept when the visitor added another quiet truth. When Emily left government service, she had opportunities to teach, consult, or disappear completely. She chose an emergency room because she wanted to help ordinary families instead of becoming a symbol of her past. Nobody standing outside had expected that answer. They had imagined medals, ceremonies, or prestigious appointments. Instead, Emily had deliberately started over as the newest nurse in a busy regional hospital where nobody knew her history. That choice earned more respect than any title could have. One of the government team members approached the older man with a brief update and handed him a small notebook recovered from personnel records after Emily completed her hiring paperwork. It contained only ordinary notes about patient communication, equipment locations, and reminders to learn coworkers' names. Tucked between 2 pages rested a faded photograph of several smiling medical personnel with their faces turned toward the camera. No names appeared beneath the image, but the older man's expression changed the moment he saw it. He carefully closed the notebook without showing anyone else. Nathan noticed the emotion in his face and realized there were still chapters of Emily's life that even these professionals carried with great care. The older man slipped the notebook into his jacket and looked toward the darkening road beyond the hospital entrance. "There is one part of her story you still do not know," he said. "And when you learn why we came ourselves instead of sending anyone else, you will understand that today was never just about bringing our medic home." The older man looked across the emergency department entrance before opening the faded notebook one final time. Instead of showing classified documents, he removed a small folded letter that had clearly been carried for years. "Emily never asked us to tell this story," he said. "In fact, she asked us not to." He paused before continuing. "But today she lost another place because she refused to explain herself, and that is something we cannot allow to happen again." Every member of the government team remained silent as if they had heard those words before. Dr. Nathan Brooks watched the man unfold the paper with remarkable care, realizing that whatever came next mattered far more than credentials or titles. The visitor looked directly at Nathan. Emily Carter was not assigned to ordinary medical support. She served as the lead combat medic for one of our most specialized operational teams. Nobody reacted immediately because the statement itself felt impossible. The older man continued before disbelief could become another misunderstanding. When missions extended far beyond immediate evacuation, she became the difference between bringing people home and leaving families without answers. She was selected because of her medical judgment, her discipline, and her ability to keep making sound decisions after everyone else had reached their limit. Nathan remembered the patient Emily had tried to protect on her final shift and felt every earlier assumption collapse under its own weight. The clues had always been there. Her insistence on checking equipment before every shift, her habit of memorizing evacuation routes, her unusual organization of trauma carts, and her refusal to argue when challenged had never been signs of arrogance. They were the routines of someone who had spent years preparing for situations where small mistakes carried lasting consequences. A nurse standing beside Nathan covered her mouth as she whispered that Emily had thanked every paramedic who brought patients into the emergency department, even on the busiest days. The older man smiled for the first time. She always respected the people who carried others to safety because she knew exactly what that responsibility felt like. Another member of the team stepped forward carrying a small protective case. He opened it just enough for the older man to remove a weathered medical insignia attached to faded fabric. There was nothing flashy about it. No polished metal, no decorative display, only a patch worn by years of service. Every member of the government team instinctively straightened their posture the moment it appeared. Without anyone giving an order, they raised their hands in a formal salute toward the patch before it was returned to the case. Hospital employees stood frozen. They had expected rank or ceremony to earn that level of respect. Instead, seasoned professionals honored a medic whose greatest achievements had never appeared in public. The older man lowered his hand and spoke with unmistakable pride. People often remember the operators. We remember the medic who refused to leave them behind. Nathan could not find the words to answer. He thought about Emily placing her employee badge on the conference room table without resentment, accepting humiliation rather than revealing a past she had promised to leave untouched. That decision suddenly seemed greater than any recognition she could have claimed. She had chosen humility over reputation, service over recognition, and ordinary patience over extraordinary stories. The helicopter continued waiting under the evening sky as though time itself had paused for one woman who never wanted attention. Then a communications specialist received a message through his headset and turned toward the older man. "Sir, we have located Miss Carter." Relief spread across every face, but the older man did not move immediately. He looked once more at Dr. Nathan Brooks and said, "There is still one conversation that has to happen before we take our medic home, and it is the conversation she has spent years trying to avoid." The communications specialist's report changed the atmosphere without changing anyone's voice. Emily Carter had been located less than 3 miles from the hospital at a small neighborhood diner where she had stopped for coffee before deciding what to do next. The older man closed his headset and looked toward Dr. Nathan Brooks. "She does not know we are here because of her," he said. Nathan did not hesitate. "I am coming with you." Nobody questioned the decision. During the short drive, Nathan looked out the window replaying every conversation he had shared with Emily during her brief time at St. Andrew's Regional Medical Center. None of them had been remarkable on the surface. She had asked practical questions about patient flow, equipment storage, and staffing. She had thanked environmental services employees by name. She had stayed after shifts to prepare trauma rooms for people she would never meet. The deeper truth was painful because he finally understood that she had never been trying to prove she belonged there. She had already belonged everywhere lives needed protecting. When the vehicles arrived outside the diner, there was no dramatic rush inside. The government team entered with ordinary manners, drawing only curious glances from other customers. Emily sat alone near the window with a paper cup of coffee and a folded employment packet beside her. She looked up as the older man approached and offered the same small smile she had worn at the hospital. "You found me faster than I expected," she said. The older man smiled in return. "You always said good coffee was easier to find than a good hiding place." Emily laughed softly at the familiar joke before noticing Nathan standing several feet behind the group. Her expression shifted with surprise rather than resentment. Nathan stepped forward holding her employee badge in both hands instead of placing it in his pocket. "I made a decision before. I understood who you were," he said. "More importantly, I made it before I understood how you cared for people. I cannot change this afternoon, but I can admit that I was wrong." Emily accepted the badge without immediately putting it on. "Dr. Brooks," she replied, "you made the best decision you could with the information you had. That is what every emergency physician does every day." Nathan lowered his eyes because her answer carried no bitterness at all. She had given him the same grace she routinely gave frightened patients and overwhelmed coworkers. The older man watched the exchange without interrupting. One of the nurses who had accompanied Nathan then stepped forward carrying the folded checklist Emily had written. "We kept using your trauma cart layout after you left," she admitted. "Everything worked better." Emily looked genuinely surprised. "If it helped even one patient, then it was worth the effort," she answered. She did not mention specialized training, difficult assignments, or the years that shaped those habits. Her concern remained fixed on ordinary people receiving better care. The older man finally spoke. "Emily, it is time for us to bring you home." She looked toward the helicopter waiting in the distance before returning her attention to Nathan and the nurses beside him. "Home has meant different things at different times," she said. "For the last few days, I hoped it might become an emergency room again." Nathan understood the invitation hidden inside those words. Respect was no longer something expressed through speeches or ceremonies. It lived inside changed hearts, better judgment, and a willingness to see someone beyond a title. As Emily stood from the table, every member of the government team instinctively stepped aside to let her walk first, not because protocol required it, but because genuine respect had already made the decision for them. Emily slipped her employee badge into the pocket of her jacket instead of clipping it back onto her shirt. She thanked every member of the government team for coming, then turned toward Dr. Nathan Brooks with the same composed expression she had carried since the day they first met. "Patients will still need good nurses tomorrow," she said. "That part never changes." The older man nodded with quiet understanding before inviting her toward the waiting helicopter. But Emily paused long enough to shake hands with the environmental services employee who had happened to arrive outside the diner after finishing a shift. She remembered his name without hesitation. The simple gesture reminded everyone watching that genuine respect had always been part of who she was, long before anyone learned about her past. The return trip to St. Andrew's Regional Medical Center was different from the tense afternoon that had begun with misunderstanding. The helicopter lifted away while the government vehicles departed in separate directions, leaving no ceremony behind and no public announcement for curious onlookers. Before leaving, the older man handed Nathan a sealed envelope. Inside was not a commendation or a classified document, but a short note written in Emily's own handwriting years earlier. It read, "Prepare well, care for people, and never waste time proving your worth." Nathan folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the handwritten checklist that had started changing his perspective. Neither document contained extraordinary secrets, yet together they explained more about Emily's character than any official record ever could. During the following weeks, small changes quietly reshaped the emergency department. The trauma carts remained organized according to Emily's system because the nurses discovered it consistently reduced unnecessary movement during busy shifts. New employee orientation included practical equipment preparation instead of relying only on written manuals. Staff members began introducing themselves to housekeeping, transport teams, and paramedics by name because they had seen how naturally Emily treated every person as an essential part of patient care. No plaque appeared on the wall, and no hallway carried her name. Her influence survived through routines that made ordinary work a little better every single day. Nathan also changed in ways his colleagues noticed before he did. He spent more time listening before reaching conclusions. He asked younger nurses to explain their observations instead of dismissing them because of limited experience. Whenever someone suggested preparing for a situation that had not happened yet, he no longer called it unnecessary caution. He called it professionalism. Occasionally, he would glance toward the locker Emily had briefly used during her short employment. It remained empty, yet it never felt abandoned. It served as a quiet reminder that remarkable people often arrive without introducing themselves. Several months later, a new graduate nurse nervously reported a subtle concern about a patient whose condition appeared stable. Instead of interrupting, Nathan listened carefully, ordered additional evaluation, and discovered the early signs of a complication before it became an emergency. As the patient recovered, he looked toward the neatly arranged trauma card and smiled to himself. Some lessons were taught in classrooms, while others were left behind by people who never asked to be remembered. Far above the city, another helicopter crossed the evening sky on its way to somewhere unknown, and for just a moment Nathan imagined Emily already helping someone else who needed her steady hands. He returned to the emergency department, picked up the next patient chart, and began preparing for whatever came through the doors, because the greatest legacy she left behind was not her hidden past. It was the higher standards she quietly inspired everyone else to live by.